Now, for a slightly different lunchtime session, let's slow it down and take a bit longer to explore a topic that has run through this year's festival, repair. When you think about repair, you might jump to the consumer repairing something you bought that has been broken. But when you start to think about it more, it becomes more systemic. Right at the start, you need to think about how to design for repair with parts that can be taken apart and fixed. You need to think about the systems for collecting broken items so that they can be returned and mended, and also about repair skills among communities. It's a can of worms. We'll welcome two women to the stage to explore the bigger picture, and then stay tuned as straight after we have a practical how-to about how to design for repair. Katie Treggiden is an author, journalist, podcaster, and keynote speaker championing a circular approach to design. She's also the founder and director of Make a Design Circular, a membership community and online learning platform in which designer makers get to feel proud of contributing to a thriving planet with every product they make. She is currently exploring the question, can craft save the world? It's an emerging body of work. This includes her sixth book, Broken Mending and Repair in a Throwaway World, and a podcast, Circular with Katie Treggiden. Madeleine Michell has the amazing title of Social Conscious Communications Officer at Toast, an ethical fashion interiors brand. Over to you both for our lunchtime conversation.
Thanks, Alicia. So as Alicia just said, I'm the Social Conscious Communications Manager at Toast. We're a British lifestyle brand, and really since its inception, we've championed a slower and more thoughtful way of life, producing timeless pieces across women's wear, menswear, and homeware. For the past half decade, during my time at Toast, we've introduced initiatives that explore ways of extending the life of garments, whether that's through repair or passing the item on to somebody else. So really exploring the garment's life beyond its first wearer, really. I was really keen to speak to Katie today because I'm so inspired by her boundless knowledge, enthusiasm and curiosity for not only all things design, but for the health of our planet and the systems change so desperately required to better our world. So I'm really delighted to be here today.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for that introduction, Alicia. You've said all the things I was going to say about me. So I'm going to dive straight in and say that I was really excited to talk to Madeleine because I am really fascinated by the commitment that Toast has shown to repair. Brands that sell new things for a living very rarely even enable repairs, let alone encourage them. So Madeleine, perhaps I can ask you to start by telling us a little bit about Toast Circle and specifically Toast Repair, which is the free repair service you offer to your customers. What are they and why do you offer them?
Sure. So Toast Circle is really the umbrella term for all of our circular initiatives. Each one exists to reduce our waste and keep wearable and well-crafted pieces in circulation. So as you said, this includes Toast Repair, which was the first of our initiatives, and that is a free mending service that we offer. Toast Exchange, which is an events-based clothes swap. Toast Renewed, which launched earlier this year, and that's a collection of creatively, visibly repaired pieces. I'm actually wearing one today. And then Toast Rewarm, which is actually launching this week, and that is our the way in which we are offering an alternative to buying new with pieces that have been previously loved or selected from past collections. And 10% of the revenue of the sale of those reworn pieces will be donated to our charity partner Trade, which I can say a little bit more on later on. But we're specifically donating to their long-term charity partner Reed and supporting garment makers in Tamil Nadu in South India, which we're really proud to be doing. So whether it's repairing, swapping, renewing or reselling, each element of Toast Circle fosters longevity and really connects us with our community. So why repair? We started out with repair as we really felt that following design for longevity, repair is the next logical step in extending the life of an item. So it was actually after hosting a number of repair workshops with textile repairer and artist Molly Martin in our shops that we started running a successful pilot service out of our Notting Hill store in London. And that really started gaining traction and encouraged us to get behind this idea of promoting knowledge sharing and skill sharing over novelty and an obsession with the new. So the service really evolved very naturally from there. And the fact that it's free, I think, is really key, because I feel there are already enough barriers to entry when it comes to the circular economy. So it's very easy for things to just be replaced rather than repaired. And we've had some really interesting examples of that over the last day or so. So I think it's important to keep it as accessible as possible, to encourage people to repair and keep loving their items for as long as possible. It is a huge investment for us as a business. So you can bring in any item that you own from Toast, whether that is you've had it for 5 or 10 years, it doesn't matter how long you've had it, and you can discuss your mending options with our team. So you can choose between whether it's a visible repair or an invisible repair. And we specifically champion sashiko, which is a Japanese form of repair, which I can talk about a bit later on. But those particular techniques have sort of been in the collection since the beginning. Cantha stitching, you can see throughout our collections, which we really love. But to date, our team have actually repaired more than 4,000 garments. And I think that is quite incredible. They are now a team of 6, and that actually equates to the size of our design team, which is pretty amazing. But I think it's something that RAP says that 19% of the clothes in the UK are discarded because they're damaged, stained, they've lost shape, or they've just worn out. So we really feel that by taking the time to restore a well-loved item and maybe highlight its worn areas, we can really rethink our relationship with our clothing. So for us, I'd say it's about the physical and emotional longevity of our clothes. But what I thought was really interesting about the approach to your book, Katie, is that you're exploring not only that pragmatic role that mending plays, but also its societal and cultural roles. So could you tell us a little bit more about your approach, and then perhaps tell us what you meant or what you mean by repair as restoration of function in the book?
Yeah, sure. So I was really conscious of the fact, as you said, that, we live in this sort of throwaway society. We don't really need to mend anymore. It's usually quicker, easier, cheaper to replace something than it is to repair it, sadly, those barriers to repair you mentioned. And in fact, in 2008, a leading design historian called Hazel Clark declared that mending had died out. Now, if you count, and this is kind of a way of tracking culture, if you count every time the word darning appears in The Guardian or The Observer between the year 2000 and the year 2019, something I actually did as part of my master's research, what you find is by 2008, the year that Hazel Clark said mending had died out, the word darning was on the increase already. So mending was actually starting to come back by 2008. Now, obviously, the financial crisis had something to do with that. There was an element of pragmatism there. But I was really interested to find out why. Why do we mend when in the vast majority of cases we don't really need to? And most of the scholarship categorizes types of mending according to what they achieve pragmatically, thereby assuming that all mending lives in this sort of pragmatic category. So I wanted to take a different approach, and I wanted to look, as Madeleine says, at the societal, the cultural roles that mending plays, the sort of why rather than the how. So I came up with this idea of categorizing the book according to those reasons. So I looked at repair as restoration of function, which is the sort of most obvious pragmatic reason to mend something, but also repair as storytelling, repair as activism, repair as healing, and also the regeneration of natural systems as a form of repair. So this idea that it's not enough to simply mend the things we've already taken out of the earth, but that we also need to repair the natural systems that we've broken in the process of taking those materials to turn into objects. But as you suggested, Madeleine, let's dive in first to repair as the restoration of function. And it's interesting because in some ways you have that sense of, well, you're just putting something back to how it was. You're just undoing the damage, but it's never quite that simple. And I love Gary Nabham's term restoriation instead of restoration. which speaks to this idea that as soon as you mend something, you change the trajectory of that object's story. You choose what to repair, how much to dial that damage back, and how much to leave something sort of in its slightly damaged state. So this idea of good as new, which is often what we say with pride after a repair, is rarely actually the case. And here's what I don't understand about Toast. Well, I do, but it kind of fascinates me. You sell new clothes that are as good as new, right? And yet you also offer a free service which will return customers' clothes to as good as new, thereby in theory cannibalizing your own sales, right? Why would somebody buy another Toast item if they can have the one they've already got repaired? And you've mentioned that this is a huge investment on behalf of the brand, you know, kind of hiring all those repair specialists, offering that as a free service. So what prompted the brand to think this is something we should be offering?
Yeah, totally. Well, first of all, I love the restoration and function chapter and how you've all just laid all of that out. But it is a really interesting one, right? Of course, we're in the business of designing, making, and selling functional and beautiful clothing. Toast isn't trend-led, but rather very much leans into timeless design and creating clothing and objects that can stand the test of time and have both a physical and design durability. I know I touched on that a little bit before, but I guess to answer the question in short, no, there isn't a cannibalization of sales, nor really a worry about it, I guess, because I'd say if our repair service, if anything, instills confidence in our community that should damage or wear occur, then as of course it will do naturally over time, then there's the option to have it have that item repaired, and maybe not back to its original state, but it can be done so it's not that far off. But I think that, and I know we both agree on this, that is the beauty of repair, the fact that items become an item becomes that repair of that item, becomes part of the story, and not only of that item but of the individual that owns it. And similarly, if a piece of clothing no longer fits with your lifestyle, or your just style in general, because we all change, then you can pass that on to someone else through one of our clothes shops, for example. But I guess with repair, and it's not only is it about timeless design, but it's also about material choice. So we opt for natural fibers, and actually we're 80% natural fiber across our womenswear and menswear collections. And firstly, my understanding is that natural fibers are easier to repair. So a tear in a 100% pair of cotton trousers can be easily reinforced using a patch of a similar weight cotton fabric, and a simple sashiko stitch, for example. However, if you add in the stretchy threads of maybe elasticated jeans, then it becomes much trickier because those splintered and stretchy threads sort of get in the way. And that's just one example. But secondly, I'd say that our business is modeled on true collaboration, and our makers and suppliers across the globe are our true partners, and that collaboration between designer, product developer, and production partner is really key to achieving that enduring kind of style and outcome that we really champion. So the offering of both invisible and visible repair techniques is also inspired by the artisans that we work with. Japanese inspired workwear is what introduced us to sashiko repair, and actually sashiko directly translates as little stabs, as that kind of motion of the running stitch that reinforces the garment is reminiscent of small piercings to the cloth, and I really love that. And then also our close partnership with a cooperative in West Bengal who make our Toast Cantha gowns, which are staples and have been since the beginning in our collection, have also influenced our approach to repair, as each gown is created using that Cantha stitch technique and using layers of recycled saris that create this really interesting, unique cloth. But yes, those who bring back their clothes do have that choice, and it's not always a case of making something as good as new. And I love that term restoration, because I think we do that at Toast too. And there's a chapter in your book on repair as storytelling. And what does that mean? And what are your thoughts on the visible mending movement, particularly as it is becoming so popular now?
So very popular. And it's a tricky subject So on the one hand, I think it's absolutely wonderful that people are talking about wearing a darn as a badge of honor. You know, we can see the repairs to the top of your top there, which is, you know, something you've chosen to wear to this conference today to spark conversations about repair. And I think that is really important, you know, that we had a fantastic keynote this morning from Bas van Abel of Fairphone, who was talking about this importance of changing the culture. You know, tech is not necessarily going to save us. We have to change the culture, and having those visibly mended pieces that can spark conversations and start to shift ideas about what it means to wear a piece of repaired clothing, I think is really important. And I think there are people who are doing that really well. I think Toast does it well. In the book, I profile several menders, including Celia Pim, Keiko Matsui, and Hans Tan, all of whom I think do it very well with a lot of sort of respect and sensitivity. And one of my favorite ways to start a sentence, there is nuance here, because I think there is privilege in feeling comfortable wearing something that's been visibly mended. Firstly, you've got to have a garment that's been made to quality standards that allow it to be mended. And you mentioned that idea of natural fibers being a lot easier to mend. If you've got something, you know, from a very cheap online retailer, it's going to be harder to mend. And so there's what in the repair movement is known as a poverty tax there. Secondly, you've got to move in circles where people are going to go, hey, cool meant, and see it as creative or sustainable or interesting or a conversation starter, rather than being in situations where that's just going to be seen as a sign of poverty. And that can be something that triggers shame. And I think a lot of the environmental movement has been criticized as being quite middle class. And I think we've got to be very careful that we're trying to change the culture rather than criticizing individuals, because it's just not accessible. You know, if you wear a uniform to work, you're not going to be able to turn up with a visibly mended uniform. So I think we've got to be careful about eco-shaming. And then I think the final point is there's a risk of cultural appropriation and class appropriation. Most mending techniques have emerged out of poverty, and a lot of the techniques that have become popular in the visible mending movement have emerged out of cultures that the people practicing them don't necessarily have a full understanding of. And so I think it's a brilliant thing to use mending as a form of storytelling. I think the note of caution that I would share is the question of understanding which stories are yours to tell. And I often encourage people to look to their own heritage, for, you know, we have a fantastic heritage of darning and patchwork in kind of Euro-centered cultures. And so just making sure that you fully understand the techniques that you're using and the stories you're telling, and making sure that you have the sort of permission, the knowledge, the understanding to share those stories, I guess. I could talk about this for a long time because I wrote my dissertation about the class and cultural appropriation of mending techniques, so I'll leave it there. But I know that Toast has collaborated with Celia Pim, who is somebody who I think does this very, very well, drawing on her own heritage and family stories. And I think Toast Renewed is also a really lovely example of visible mending. Why don't you share some of the stories that have emerged from your collaborations with Celia and from the wider Toast Renewed project?
Sure, and I totally hear you on this. I think you've articulated that nuance extremely well. I feel very lucky to have collaborated with Celia Pim over the years, and she's taught me a lot in the repair arena. I'd say we've always been very open and honest about which repair techniques we use and why, and the cultures that they've emerged from and what they mean to those people. And I agree, it's a vital part of the conversation. We do have to really check our privilege. Craft and traditional craftsmanship is central to what we do at Toast, and honouring the hands that make our pieces is vital. And in a small way, we teaching people the skills to repair those items kind of enhances that honour. It's empowering to learn about these techniques, where they originate from, and how you can keep them going across generations and cultures. But as you say, that's something that Celia does beautifully. There's a real collaboration between the mender and the person having something mended. Our repair specialists refer to that often, and the stories shared between the two individuals about how the damage came about in the first place and the type of repair that they would like can be quite special. When that item of clothing is worn, it begins to show its age through quite a unique patina, and threadbare areas, tears and holes become those markers of a piece that has been really loved. and those areas of damage, I guess, don't need to mean that that garment has reached the end of its life. Instead, that it could be repaired or refreshed with a visible mend if your situation so allows and if you want that. But our first collaboration with Celia was in 2019, and it was a beautiful example of how collective storytelling really can highlight how damaged garments become evidence of our movements and actions and hold the imprint of the wearer. So Toast commissioned Celia to explore how a family of Toast sweaters, and actually a pair of socks as well, have been worn over time, and they belong to members of the Toast community who all responded to this call out on social media. But for the project, she spoke with each owner, discussing the cause of the damage and hearing about the particular stories that attached to each piece. And through her interviews, she kind of caught a snapshot of everyday life and small habits and routines and rituals that fill our time, from whether that's gardening or train commutes or hospital visits even. I always remember with Toast Repair, a lovely lady called Kate, who brought in a yellow coat mended by a repair specialist, Emily, based up in Edinburgh. And Kate had been wearing her coat almost constantly, she said, for 3 years in all weathers. It faded on the hood, and the shoulders but also had faded to a softer kind of lemony yellow. And as she'd worn it kind of every day since it arrived, she was very upset when it ripped. She fell actually on a stony beach and threw her hand out to catch herself. And suddenly there was a 40-centimetre rip right down the side. And when she looked at the damage, she was sure she was going to have to find a replacement, but she had actually attended one of our workshops the year prior, and so she knew that we would hopefully be able to do something about it. And Emily transformed that damage into what Kate said was a beautiful landscape of stitches. And it kind of echoed that soft lemon of the more faded parts of the coat. And she reinforced the corner of the pocket, which was now the weakest point, with a sort of a block of stitches and the bold kind of stroke of lemon paint. But Kate then loved the fact that her scarred coat was then able to stay with her, and it became completely unique. So not only are we able to share stories through that kind of consultation process with the individual, but also we've been able to do that when we work in public spaces such as Somerset House and Burr House in London, where we're in situations where we're able to connect with people on repair outside of Toast spaces, such as our stores, which is where we mainly do it. And that really excites me because it broadens the conversation and it kind of spreads the message further. Obviously, you and I actually have some plans in the pipeline for bringing a range of community groups across the country, repair, and doing some sessions. Bit of a side note, but I'm really excited for that, so I had to mention. But Celia said to me before that when someone brings her something for repair, she's always sort of startled by how at that moment they're not really just talking about the clothing, they're actually talking about their individual life and the life that they lead. She and our repair specialists can of course mend those objects, but what do you think the role repair plays in healing people, relationships and communities, for example?
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? And I love the fact that Celia says she's often more interested in the damage than the repair, and those conversations that happen over those damaged objects are often about loss or grief, or, you know, people might bring in something from a relative who's passed away. And in fact, the item that got Celia interested in mending was a jumper that had belonged to her great uncle, and he would sit on an armchair with a board across the arms and draw, and so this part of the jumper would wear away and her great aunt would darn it, but her great aunt died before her great uncle did. So when her great uncle died and she inherited those jumpers, she finished the job and finished the darning, and that's how she got into darning. And so I think there's this real connection between mending and sort of mending objects and mending people, communities, the environment, those sorts of things. But it's interesting because I had all of this swirling around in my head, and the working title for this chapter was something along the lines of repairing as healing / community / this / that, and it just wasn't coming together. And actually I had a conversation with Ekta Call at the Somerset House exhibition Eternally Yours, where Toast had commissioned her to make this incredible sort of wall hanging, I guess you'd call it. and it was made from offcuts of sort of bits of Toast clothing and also her own work. And so I was standing sort of looking at this piece, thinking about all these things swirling around in my head. So I knew that mending had a role to play in personal well-being. There's research into anxiety and depression that Celia often talks about, that the repetitive movement of stitching kind of calms your central nervous system. There's a wonderful bit in the book Shot Glass as Soulcraft by Matthew Crawford, where he talks about how to mend a washing machine. And he's saying you have to listen to it, you have to look at it, you have to come out of yourself and kind of into the washing machine. And it struck me that there's a technique for managing anxiety where you tune into each of your 5 senses in turn. You name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can feel, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. And it just struck me that his method of mending was very similar to that technique for managing anxiety. And there's also a book called Lifting Depression by Kelly Lambert, who's a neuroscientist. And she says that the way our brains work, consumerism, ordering something on an online shop and it arriving the next day, doesn't involve enough effort to light up the reward centers in our brain. So there's evidence to show that consumerism is driving depression. And actually something like mending, where there's a more delayed gratification and you have to put that effort in to get the reward, is actually much better for our well-being and our mental health. So I knew there was this kind of personal well-being bit. I knew from my own experience, and I write in the book about an experience I had mending a top for my little sister, a top she had bought from a cheap shop on the high street. And so I sort of did my best. It was more a question of edging the holes rather than fixing the holes. And I patched some trousers for her sons, and I wrote a little, sort of stitched a little message into the care label for her. And I became unexpectedly emotional. You know, my family have this weird idea that I have mending skills now. I've written a book about mending, so they send me stuff. I was like, fine, I'll mend it. So it was kind of like doing a bit of a chore for her. But as I was doing it, I became really overwhelmed with love and affection for my sister and my nephews. And so there was this sense that it was repairing a relationship. And then there was this other piece that was about communities. So I've interviewed the people involved in repair cafes and the Restart Project and all of those sorts of things. And there's this real sense, particularly of intergenerational relationships. So there was this idea when they started the repair cafes that there'd be loads of stuff to mend, but would anybody come and help mend it? But actually they were overwhelmed with particularly older volunteers. And there's lots of evidence about the loneliness being endemic in older generations. And so I knew there were these connections within communities, someone you might have walked past on the street the day before, suddenly you've had a conversation with. But it was actually talking to Ekta, and I asked her, and it sounded like a rude question, but I said, I'm sorry, Ekta, but I don't understand how this is mending. To me, this is using waste. Should have gone to my last book. And I was like, it's a genuine question. Tell me how it's mending. And she explained that her maternal grandmother had died when her mother was a young girl. So Ekta had never met her. And she went back to the area of Kolkata where she understood that her maternal grandmother was from, to try and learn more about her, understand where she might have lived, and have this idea of sort of, you know, reconnecting. And when she got there, nobody could remember her. No, there were no leads. Every kind of thing she thought she might be able to find out about her grandmother led to a dead end. And she came home really upset, almost feeling more distant from this maternal grandmother than ever. And then she realized that she could use her art form, which is usually making maps in textiles, to process this grief and to reconnect with her maternal grandmother. So she stitched this beautiful map on what she calls the ground cloth, which is all the little bits of sort of white or cream fabric with this black stitching of where she believes her maternal grandmother lived, of the neighborhood. But the exact spot where she believed her grandmother lived, she left blank, to sort of echo the fact that she had never quite found her. And she said it was a really powerful way to heal her grief, to mend those feelings of loss, to process her emotions and create new memories. And so that was where this idea of repair as a form of healing came from. And that, for me, tied together all those different types of the ways in which we can use the process of repair to heal ourselves as people, to heal our relationships, and to heal. I mean, we even talk about fractured communities, don't we? This sense of healing their communities. And I know that in your work at Toast, Madeleine, you've experienced the power of repair as a form of healing. Perhaps you can share some examples of where you've seen that happen at the sort of personal, community and environmental level.
Yeah, sure. And what you just said then about fractured communities, it made me think of something that, again, I know we've dropped her name a few times, but something that Celia said about we talk about bones being knitted back together, or they talk about that term in the medical world. And anyway, that just really made me think of that.
Yeah, and actually, if you Google darning in academic journals, you get more medical journals than anything else, because it's used as a metaphor so much.
Yeah, that's so interesting. But yeah, I absolutely adored that piece that Hector created for the toast display at Turnley Yours. It was a really beautiful example of how that process of sewing torn, broken, and discarded fabrics can represent the repairing of a relationship, as you said, or even the building of one that maybe never had that opportunity to flourish. And I think that's so beautiful. And I guess there's always been that kind of twofold interest in repair for us at Toast: the environmental benefit of extending the life of garments, but also that learning of the skills that can empower and enrich our lives in some way. As we've touched on, there is something so deeply personal about mending something that sits so closely to somebody's skin. And since the beginning of our repair service, it's been all about community and not about necessarily generating revenue for the brand. It's been about more than the act itself as well, and like what the process does as well as the action. The key really is that we wanted to encourage people to not only have their clothing repaired, but perhaps learn how to do it themselves and build confidence in their own abilities to look after their belongings. We've always had that kind of strong sense of community, and I think that was one of my most favorite discoveries when I joined the brand, that it just felt so strong, and that's absolutely accelerated through our online workshops. I think the first time we introduced online about 3 years ago, we had 4 people attend our first repair workshop, and that grew to over 100 in a very short space of time. And it was actually during that first session, one lovely lady that joined us, she actually worked in the NHS at the time, and explained that obviously it was that was during the first round of COVID, and she said that she was going to be taking her Sashiko Mend with her in her bag and pull it out during her breaks to soothe her and really channel that anxious energy into that slow and repetitive movement that you mentioned. It was, for her, that was her way of decompressing, and as you said, a very real way of calming her nervous system. But one of our repair specialists has also spoken very openly about her own journey with repair and her mental health. And she discussed it. She kind of talks about how when she's able to mend, when she doesn't feel she's able to mend what's going on inside her head, being able to tangibly mend an item of clothing or an object in front of her really feels like a triumph. And for me, that's been really eye-opening and powerful to learn about how physical repair and the motions involved have the ability to heal that kind of past and present trauma. But I guess thinking to another of your chapters, something that artist and textile repairer Molly Martin, who I mentioned earlier, has always said during our workshops, is that repair is a defiant act in the face of consumerism. And I really like that. I like that it sticks with me as a reminder of how choosing to repair something rather than replace it, we can kind of do our bit. But I'm curious, like, is that activism? And I tend to think of activism, myself and maybe some of our audience here, as maybe it's shouting and protests and not necessarily the quiet work of mending. But yet you have a whole chapter in your book on repair as activism, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and I really do think that repair is a form of activism. And I also think it's important that activism is a broad enough church to encompass the different ways that different people feel able to show up. So protest is a very important form of activism, but not accessible for some people. You know, if large crowds frighten you, if you're a wheelchair user, you know, there are many reasons. If you don't live near places where the big protests happen, it can be really difficult to engage. I mean, often if you're not an extroverted person, it can be a hard kind of process. And so I came across the term craftivism, which I think is such a lovely term for this more gentle activism. It was coined by Betsy Greer, and it's a word for that sort of quiet work involving craft that we can use to protest. Matt Ratto talks about critical making, which is a play on the term critical thinking. But although these are new terms, the idea of craft as a form of activism has a really long history. So the suffragettes used craft as a form of protest in the 20th century. The anti-suffragette movement was claiming that women didn't want the vote. It was just this small group of unwomanly women who wanted the vote. Real women didn't want to vote. And so it was quite clever that suffragettes used craft, which at the time, and still is to a certain extent, was seen as a very feminine hand skill, to make brooches, to make banners. There's even a silk handkerchief in which everybody who was on hunger strike in Holloway prison embroidered their signatures. So it was this way of saying, yes, we are womanly, and yes, we also want the vote, which I thought was a very clever use of craft. Another project which really moved me was the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. So it's believed to be the biggest piece of community art in the world, and it comprises 48,000 panels. And each panel is the approximate dimensions of a coffin, and it's been made by friends and family to remember someone who's died from AIDS. And it sort of gets laid out in huge squares in America, and it was actually one of the things that made the American government start to pay attention at the height of the AIDS crisis. And even if you think of something like punk, and the way that intentionally ripped and damaged clothes were sort of quote unquote mended with safety pins, there was this idea of subverting the notion that clean and undamaged clothes were somehow natural, and dirty and damaged clothes, which at the time were very much seen as the preserve of the poor, were somehow unnatural. And so this use of repair, using a safety pin, was kind of subverting some of those notions to sort of reclaim the agency of the working classes. So it's got this long history. And in the book, I look at sort of very literal interpretations. So Bridget Harvey has an amazing jumper called the Mend More Buy Less jumper, which is a secondhand jumper. And on the front, she's appliqued using waste fabric, mend more, buy less. And then she literally took that to a protest on a stick, on a hanger as a protest banner. So that's a sort of literal way in which mending has been used as repair. But there's another maker, A.R. Haidar, in the book, who has got the most incredible pieces. One are shoes that have been worn out from refugees on their journey to Britain, and she's embroidered their journeys onto the soles of the shoes. And they're just so, they were in the Eternally Yours exhibition at Somerset House, and they're just incredible. And then there's another piece she created where every day for a year, when she had one of her young children, I mean, she still has all of her young children at home, but when one of them was a baby, every day for a year, she wrote down one act of invisible labor that she'd taken as a woman. And then she collected, little muslin cloths and little, vests they'd grown out of, and all this sort of textile that is generated by small children, and embroidered a representation of that act onto it. And she then hung them on washing lines in an art gallery at a height that children could run around underneath them completely unaware of them. But for grown-ups, they were completely claustrophobic because they were kind of at eye height. So you had to sort of fight your way through them. Mm-hmm. And then she priced that work at minimum wage times 24 hours times 365 days. And so I think there are ways that we can use mending and craft and more sort of gentle skills to make really powerful points in activism work. And as I say, I think that's important because that makes activism work available to a much broader swathe of people. I'm interested, do you see what Toast is doing as a form of activism? Are you seeing the positive impact you'd hoped for? Is it having that sort of intended impact?
Yeah, I mean, wow, there's some incredible examples there. So powerful and actually so emotional. I remember seeing that not that washing line one, that is a new discovery for me. I that sounds amazing. But I remember the shoes from the Eternally Yours exhibition, and my sister and she came to see it, and it was hard not to be so touched by it, and our eyes were just sort of full of water. But it's really powerful work. But it's an interesting question, and I'd say that my initial answer would be that it wasn't repair for Toast wasn't necessarily intended to be activism, but it was certainly intended to raise awareness and demonstrate an alternative to discarding and replacing. So maybe in that sense, it sort of is. And having started our journey in repair through workshops and teaching kind of skills, our hope was always to prompt discussion and encourage sharing of learning. So we really wanted people to consider repairing a garment and extending its life, because that feels like the first step in shifting kind of buying habits and behavior. We talked a lot about behavior and the need for behavioral change if we're going to drive bigger systems change. But I guess I love the fact that we've created the role of the repair specialist at Toast. I studied textile design when I graduated, and when I graduated, a repair specialist hadn't really crossed my mind to become, or it hadn't really presented itself as a viable career path. So there wasn't any such thing that I knew of, apart from you have seamstresses in-house. I wasn't aware of kind of a repair specialist. And so I love that. And I feel that even their presence in our shops, so we have a repair specialist in 6 of our shop locations across the UK, really encourages the thinking that kind of members of our community or people that just come across us, you start to think that you can be an active citizen and not a passive consumer. That's a phrase that I've read, unable to quote where from, but that really stuck with me. You can come in and you can learn how to repair something, because it's important that you're kind of aware of all of your options when something has been damaged or reached the end of its kind of perceived first life. But I guess our workshops and community building has continued since those early days, and we often partner with organisations to broaden our impact and drive change. We've always offered alongside the service being free, our workshops have been free, but we've had optional donations as part of that. And over the years, we've raised over £74,000 for various charities. But Crafts Council UK is actually an ongoing charity partner for us. And last year, we broadened our work together by hosting a 2-day mending workshop for their young craft citizens with Celia Pym to explore textile repair. And through our wider events programme at the Somerset House exhibition, we donated over £1,000 to the Somerset House Young Talent Fund, and that provides bursaries and financial relief to artists, as well as opportunities for underrepresented people aged 18 to 25. So I guess in that sense, working with those organisations is sort of that kind of idea of activism and trying to drive change. There was actually also the Action for Conservation, which were a really cool group that I wasn't familiar with until we worked with Somerset House. They're based there, and it's an organisation working with 13 to 17-year-olds from urban areas in the southeast. And we delivered a Sashiko repair workshop for them. And that session really highlighted the potential of developing repair skills to trigger positive change. I think it was somebody yesterday asked a question around arts education and arts education in earlier stages of education. And that's something I've been passionate about personally for a long time. And I did my dissertation around it and this idea of participatory design and getting people involved in those skills. Could that have the ability to change your mindset? So when it comes to buying and buying new, would you actually consider making something even? So I think that's kind of interesting ways in which Toast is, the approach that we've had wasn't necessarily intended to be activism, but it kind of has ended up being in what we were trying to achieve. But obviously, some things do reach the end of their useful life. And at that stage, when things are beyond the point of repair, there has to be a next step. And so I just want to address that and just weave that kind of back into this central theme of collaboration, because I mentioned earlier, we've partnered with Trade, who are a UK charity working towards reducing the social and environmental impact of our clothes. So any Toast item that we're not able to repurpose through our circle initiatives will be donated to Trade for them to responsibly reuse. It's important to note that we will take back all unwanted clothing, accessories and textiles, regardless of quality or condition, so that they can either be donated, recycled, potentially remade into new designs in future. That's something we really hope to do, or be resold. And we're really proud to be partnering with them to learn from their expertise in the realm of reuse. They have the means via long-term industry partnerships to offer a solution for those unsalvageable items, and every aspect of their work, of trades work, aims to minimize, transform and improve the impact of our clothes. So from stopping clothes being thrown away and extending the life of them through charity shops, or to delivering sustainable education and funding international development projects that tackle issues central to our industry. They kind of really work very hard in that realm, so I'm excited to be working with them. But bringing it back to you, Katie, what does all of this mean? The introduction to your book, which I love, is called A Case for Paying Attention, and calls out that need to hold the stare with what is broken, not only in a literal sense, but also in terms of our systems and structures. How do you think that mending and repair can help us to do that?
Yeah, so I wrote that introduction in July 2022. So UK temperatures had just exceeded 40 degrees for the first time. Airport runways were melting, railway lines were warping, people across Europe were dying. I drove past a wildfire, and I live in Cornwall, a county which is famous for its mizzle. And anybody who's not familiar with that term, it's a portmanteau of the words mist and drizzle. So believe me when I say Cornwall is a damp county, despite what summer holidays might have you believe. And in that moment, I had a real sense that just everything was broken. You know, our systems, our structures, government, big business, kind of all the huge, seemingly incontractable kind of systems and structures and cultures that we live within were broken. But that's really hard to hold the stare with, right? It's too hurtful, it's too unfair, it's too frightening. And so you feel down about it for a couple of days and then you look away. And I think what repair does, and even as you say, something as simple as having your repair specialists visible in your shops, is it asks us to get more comfortable with the idea of damage. We can't mend things until we admit they're broken. And I think far too many people, governments, institutions, big companies, are still acting like everything's okay. And that's why I love what Celia Pym says about being more interested in the damage than the repair, because if we're brave enough to pay attention, to hold the stare, we're going to see a lot of damage. And that's going to be uncomfortable, but we're also going to see opportunities for restoration, for storytelling, for healing, for activism, for regeneration, for repair, right? And that, I think, is really exciting.
Absolutely. Gosh, I feel like we could probably talk about this for hours. Yeah, I wonder whether we've got any questions from the audience.
Yes, we do. So we've got quite a few, so I'll just take us on the journey. So the first one is from Toby. This is really inspiring, considering this is a global problem and requires a global approach. What would Kate and Madeleine consider to be the key things the UK government should do to help build this repair wave?
Want me to go first, Madeleine?
Yes, go ahead. You go.
I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because we've all got a role to play in this, but government do have a big role. And I think it's about some of the things actually that were touched on in the Fairphone keynote this morning, which is that so many things are not only difficult to repair, but impossible to repair. You know, if you can't get the thing open, or if you do get it open, you've invalidated its warranty. And I think there is legislation coming, but it doesn't go far enough. We need to make laws that say that anybody who is making something needs to make its repair accessible. So that's things like providing repair manuals, providing spare parts, allowing something to be opened with an ordinary screwdriver, not a specialist screwdriver. And so I think government can play a big role in that sense, in the changing of legislation, so that the people who are making things have to take into account what happens when it breaks and enable that repair to be easy, normalized and accessible for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many parallels from that Fairphone example that we heard earlier on to clothing and offering repair guides. That's something that we do across our channels, is actually teaching people and provide, and if they need a specific thread or a specific fabric, then they can get in touch with us and actually get hold of it. I think yeah, there's been so many examples with our product team where they've had people get in touch because they want to either they want the fabric to make something similar. And so I think that kind of accessibility to behind the scenes is vital. I know that's not necessarily government related, but I agree that it is that legislation that will push companies to doing all of that stuff.
And the care label would always have 2 spare buttons and a little bit of thread on it.
Yeah,
absolutely normal. And I think, you know, legislating for things like that could be really powerful.
Yeah, definitely. And it was something that he said, if you can't open it, you don't own it. Or I've absolutely butchered that quote, I think, but it was I think that was it. And that stuck with me too, because it's like, if you don't know how to take it apart, then and you can't put it back together, then it's not really yours. And that just stuck with me quite a lot anyway.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting because there is, in the farming industry, there are tractors that cost tens of thousands of pounds, and the manufacturers of those tractors actually say that all you've bought is a license to operate them. You literally don't own them. And they're using that as a way to ensure people come back to them for repairs rather than repairing them themselves or repairing them locally. So in some cases that quote is literally true as well as metaphorically, which is quite frightening.
Yeah, gosh.
Another question we have, which touches on a few of the points that you mentioned about kind of like looking at the Western lens. It's interesting to hear this from like it's interesting to hear about the dying out of repair. Is this from a Western lens, or is this just generalized? Maybe there's mending as well.
Sorry. Say that again.
It's interesting to hear about the dying out of repair. Is this from a Western lens, or is this more generalized?
Yeah, and I mean, that was a quote that was made by a British design historian in 2008, and I would say, yes, almost certainly from a Western lens. I don't think that's the case anymore. We're talking about sort of the return to repair, and I think it's very much coming back. But yeah, certainly there are very many parts of the world in which mending has never gone anywhere, often through necessity, but also through culture and skills being passed down. And I think, yeah, it's, as I said, it's very important we learn from some of those cultures whilst being careful not to appropriate from them. So it's that sort of delicate balance.
Definitely. Dania asks, many textile companies are making innovation on clothes with biomaterials, for example, hemp, algae, pulp from tree. It's more sustainable, almost to do upcycling. Or doing new biodegradable clothes. So is it more sustainable doing upcycling or new biodegradable clothes?
Interesting question. I think so that one of the things around upcycling or recycling, I know that there's a lot of one of the challenges actually that we're facing around kind of repurposing, for example, is that the what you've got to put into the already existing thing to break it down and then turn it into something new uses a lot of energy and a lot of time and resource. So it's it's working out kind of, if we do all of that, will it work? Can we kind of take that risk? And so there's a lot of conversation that we're having at the moment about that. And I think the developments in biomaterials are really exciting. And I think that they sort of go, I don't know that one is better than the other necessarily. I think they go along hand in hand. And I think there's some we've worked a lot with hemp in our collections, not necessarily kind of the mushroom leathers and things like that, but certainly interested in them. I am actually wearing trainers today by a brand called Flower Mountain, and they have really interesting bio materials in there. They're sort of seaweed, and that kind of fascinates me, the way that they've managed to take a material like that and turn it into a very durable, comfortable, viable product. So I love seeing the new developments, but I also think that there's quite a long way to go with upcycling and recycling to ensure that it has the impact isn't greater than the desired outcome.
I think there's also some interesting development that's sort of doing the absolute opposite of what Toast are doing, which is all about longevity. So if we kind of understand this idea that young people want to wear things for a very short period of time. There's a statistic that says something like 55% of young British women consider a garment old once it's been worn once or twice. And so it's about using the right materials. So somebody came up with a dress that was made from very, very thin, I'm not even sure what the base fabric was, but it had wildflower seeds embedded into it. So the idea was you could wear it once and then you could plant it and kind of native flowers would grow. And so I think it's about the right material for the right usage. And I think the problem with a lot of single-use fashion is it's made from plastic derivatives, which stick around for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's about coming up with material choices that reflect the length of time that something's going to be used for. So, you know, we can lean into fast fashion as long as we do it in a way that is using minimal energy to produce something, and something that can go back to nature in a way that's beneficial very quickly. But yeah, there's some incredible innovations in materials, and I look forward to seeing what happens with a lot of those.
And that's where that idea of regeneration comes in as well. Just things being made to be regenerative.
Yeah, I think it's that idea that it's not enough to do less harm anymore. We now have to actively start doing good.
I'm going to just go through two questions. So one of them specifically is about engaging with children. So not only to engage them with the items they interact with, but also to teach skills needed to carry on the momentum. Where does that sit?
Madeleine, you've probably got more experience than me in this area.
Well, I think, yeah, it's interesting. I think, so the question is how to keep them going with those skills. Yeah, I think, I mean, I haven't done loads of work with children, but worked with a range of age groups. From kind of, our audience is so broad. We have kind of, we're from people in their kind of early 20s, all the way through to kind of their 80s. So there's a real mixed audience there. And actually, when we were at Somerset House, there was these lovely girls that came to one of our repair consultation sessions, and they were over from the States, and they had never sewn before. They had never picked up a needle and thread. Wow. And I think they were over on they were pre-university, but they were that sort of age. And I had such a great chat with them, and I was like, I sort of couldn't believe, because I started doing it. I attended like an after-school sewing club when I was like 14, and that's how I really got into it. But that was interesting, because that was an extracurricular thing. Obviously, back in the day, like I know my mum and my grandmother, they did home economics, was it, or something, or was that cooking? Not sure. Anyway, the sewing was definitely part of it, and so I think that integrating more of that back into the curriculum from very early stage, and keeping it going I feel quite strongly that would, I hope that would help. Obviously, you'd get people drop off, but I think offering it as an option, and it being seen as just as important as academic skills, I think. There's a whole debate around that. That's a whole other conversation, but
I am old enough to have studied home economics, so we were taught to cook and sew at school, but under the 1990s branch of feminism that I was growing up in, we all left school very proud that we couldn't cook and couldn't sew, because those were feminine skills we didn't want anymore. You know, we wanted to enter the man's world of the sort of 90s. And so I think it's been really lovely to see some of those skills being reclaimed by women, not as something that's used to subvert them, but as something that can be quite empowering. So I think that cultural shift is important for young people to see as well.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Madeleine, Michelle, and Kate Treggiden, for such a thought-provoking conversation and discussion. So now, to be embedding this within your organizations, hopefully this is a way to build more about carbon and more repair into the way that we work, but also there's sessions that include how do you build the basic carbon literacy that makes everyone realize how important this all is. And Emma Siegel will tell us now, so please head over to that session. Or there's another session that's all about design of future food systems, and that's on the main stage. Thank you so much for joining this session, and thank you again to Madeleine and Katie.
Can I just say that Jess, our repair specialist, is also running a repair workshop at, I think, about 3 o'clock. So do tune into that as well.